Right. Right. Okay, Terry.
I think, yeah, I don't quite, we may have two tabs open, but hello, everyone. This is PTA, Portsmouth Theater Academy Live on Friday, January 1st, 2021. We made it, folks. We made it to January 1st, 2021. 2020 is officially over, and everything changes from this point forward. Today, we're going to be working and talking about the Emancipation Proclamation with Mr. Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, who will appear today in the presence in the person of Greg Eathroff. And we are kind of new at this podcasting business, but we are going to keep working it until we make it happen. And to that end, yeah, how about that? Bring a chair around, Mr. Lincoln.
Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all the ships at sea. Oh, wrong century.
But moving in the right direction, meaning progress. We survived the Civil War.
So 2020s, 1940s, about halfway there.
Yeah, indeed he is. So what does this today mean to you, Mr. Lincoln, January 1st, 1863? What does that date mean to you?
Well, it is the date that I issue the final Emancipation Proclamation. I drafted the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation back in the summer of 1862 and issued it on September 22nd. I'd been waiting on a significant Union victory to issue it because I believed that if I issued the document after a string of defeats, it would look like a cry of desperation rather than a deliberate policy choice. I needed to demonstrate that the Union had the power to back this policy up, or it would be meaningless and, if anything, counterproductive. I also needed to prepare Northern sentiment to accept the proposition. A lot of Republicans had already come around to the notion, but Republicans didn't make up the entire population of the nation. I also had to convince the war Democrats who supported my efforts to preserve the Union, but had not approved of my previous slavery policies, that the Emancipation Proclamation was necessary, as well as secure the continued support of white Unionists in the South, without whose support I believed preserving the Union was impossible. And if we lost the war, then none of our other policy goals really mattered.
Right.
And so when Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, issued an open letter to me asking why I didn't push emancipation harder, I sent him a reply saying that my job was to preserve the Union, and everything I did as president had to be directed toward that goal, whether that meant freeing all, some, or none of the slaves. Though I did state at the end of the letter that it was my personal inclination that all men everywhere shall be free. Now, this letter was useful at the time because I'd already written the Emancipation Proclamation and was just waiting to issue it. And now I had a paper trail saying, look, this is a necessary war measure. Whether you like the idea of emancipation or not, if you like the Union, we have to do this to win. And it did win me support among those more conservative elements that I needed to keep behind the war effort. In terms of history, it's played against me because a lot of people quote my letter out of context and say, see, he said he'd save the Union without freeing a single slave if he could. He didn't care about emancipation at all. There's no more vicious lie than a lie built out of a half-truth.
Let me share something along those lines in terms of that. The traditional answer to the question, who freed the slaves, was Abraham Lincoln. but many Black and other historians have placed greater emphasis on the initiative of the slaves. These slaves saw the Civil War as a potential war for abolition well before Lincoln did. By coming into Union military lines in the South, they forced the issue of emancipation on the Lincoln administration. While Lincoln continued to hesitate about the legal, constitutional, moral, and military aspects of the matter, wrote the Black historian and theologian Vincent Harding in 1981, the relentless movement of the self-liberated fugitives into the Union lines soon approached and surpassed every level of force previously known. Making themselves an unavoidable military and political issue, this overwhelming human movement of self-freed men and women took their freedom into their own hands. The Emancipation Proclamation, when it finally and belatedly came, merely confirmed and gave ambiguous legal standing to the freedom which Black people had already claimed through their own surging living proclamations. During the 1980s, this self-emancipation thesis became dominant.
I think that goes too far in the other direction. I would remind the good doctor that in my first inaugural address in March of 1861, I had already stated that slavery was the primary issue motivating secession and war, and everyone on both sides knew this. I'd been advocating the end of slavery for my entire political career. As a congressman in the 1840s, I proposed a bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, which is one of the few areas the federal government had the authority to legislate on slavery without a constitutional amendment, which I will also remind you I supported at the end of the war, running in 1864 on a platform of adopting the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery permanently. So while certainly emancipation would have been impossible without the active support and efforts of the African American community, to use your 21st century terminology, to say that the matter was forced on me doesn't fit in with the record that I had already established in the decades leading up to the war. Rather, I would say that the efforts of the African American population gave me the opening that I needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and let me do something that I wanted to do, but would not have had the opportunity to do if the Black citizens of our country or who were not acknowledged as citizens in all the United States, but we changed that after my death. Mm-hmm. Their efforts made emancipation as a legal policy possible, but they didn't force it on my administration. It was a joint effort. Mm-hmm. Their efforts and ours, it was a partnership, and it is as unjust to me and my administration say that it was forced on us as it is unjust to the African Americans who risked their lives both on the battlefield and on the Underground Railroad to bring this issue to the fore before I'd issued these documents.
So you do, but do you understand why folks would think the way that they think in terms of that? You made the statement that if you could save the Union without freeing one slave, you would do so. So therefore, the language like that certainly doesn't make you the great emancipator that you have been given.
As I've said,
title you've been given.
Again, there's no more vicious lie than a half-truth. If you look at the context of that letter, I said, my job is to save the Union, and I will do that. If I can do that by freeing all the slaves, I will do it. If I can free it by freeing none of the slaves, I will do it. If I can do it by freeing some of the slaves and leaving others alone, I will do that. Mm-hmm. I'm speaking here purely in terms of my duty as president. Mm-hmm. My personal inclination is that all men everywhere shall be free. That's how I ended the letter. Mm-hmm. And only quoting the sentence fragment where I would save the Union without freeing any slaves makes me look like this was something that I did unwillingly. It was forced on me as a necessary means of winning the war. Mm-hmm. The ironic thing is that's the message I wanted to send to war Democrats and Southern Unionists to convince them that the Emancipation Proclamation was necessary as a war winning measure. Mm-hmm. So The advertising campaign I ran to convince people that emancipation was necessary has turned around and bitten me in the saddle area in terms of the way historians judge me, because they're not looking either at the whole letter. No one ever quotes, "I wish that all men everywhere shall be free," and ignoring the context. I had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. It was sitting in my desk when I wrote the letter to Horace Greeley. I'd already resolved to destroy slavery when I wrote, if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. But
So you feel you've been unfairly treated?
yes, and while I acknowledge that the previous generation of historians treating me as a plaster saint, it gives me too much credit. This is an overcorrection and doesn't give me enough.
Gotcha.
I was a political realist, and I was always interested in what is possible. How far and how fast can we go without triggering a backlash that will destroy all our efforts? William Lloyd Garrison, as pure as he was in his anti-slavery ideals, would no more have accomplished the destruction of slavery through his methods than Roger Taney and his pro-slavery dictates on the Supreme Court would have. Attempting to do too much and failing does no more good than attempting to do nothing at all.
Okay.
And Frederick Douglass, who rather understandably was disgusted at how hesitant I seemed to be in 1861 and early 1862, later wrote, well, I cannot match Frederick Douglass's eloquence, so I will simply paraphrase, "Oh, now I get it." He wrote that by abolitionist standards, I was vacillating, hesitant, cold. But compared to the American political consensus when I was working, I was ardent, bold, and fast moving. And he recognized that the course of action I took and the timetable in which I took it was the best and surest way to end slavery. That as much as we wish things could have gone faster and been accomplished, as well as being accomplished with less bloodshed, the circumstances under which we worked meant that the policies I adopted were the best we could do.
So now, it is, am I correct in assuming or making the assumption that one of the primary reasons that it was time for the Emancipation Proclamation is that allowed the induction of almost 200,000 Black men into the Union forces? Is that
Yes, that
true?
is. It is.
How quickly did that happen after the signing on January 1st, 1863?
It had actually already been going on in an unofficial way for months before then. The first South Carolina colored infantry had been organized by Thomas Wentworth Higginson down in South Carolina. For those of you who watch 20th and 21st century films and have seen the movie Glory, they show another group of Black soldiers along with the 54th Massachusetts, the men in the red trousers. Those are the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, who are, by the way, shown very unfairly in that film to create a contrast with the 54th Massachusetts. They were actually a brave and well-disciplined force in their own right and did quite well.
Yeah, feel free to talk to the audience.
Yes,
because that is who we want to, to educate about this. Also at that battle in South Carolina, I understand that Harriet Tubman was there.
Not at the Battle of Fort Wagner itself, but she did operate in that theater. She led a raid up the Congaree River, leading United States colored troops, capturing supplies, liberating slaves, gaining valuable intelligence information for the Union forces operating in the area. But that happened after the Battle of Fort Wagner.
Okay, so Fort Wagner's battle, when was that?
That was in June of 1863.
Okay, all right.
Wait, I'm sorry, July. The first combat for the 54th Massachusetts was on James Island in June, but the battle for which they get the big publicity was in July.
Okay. And is it true that basically the Emancipation Proclamation did not free anyone who was not already free?
No, it's not.
You're kind of a little thin-skinned about this, Mr. Lincoln. I would think you've toughened up by now.
Well, when you catch the same accusations for 160 years, it wears on you. It's true that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free most slaves immediately, de facto. De jure policy that can't be enforced is just text. However, if you look at the wording of the Emancipation Proclamation, the areas that are and are not covered are not based on the lines of military control. They're based on zones of political control. I was operating under my war powers, so I could act in areas where the regular civil government of the United States no longer functioned, where the courts were no longer in operation, where unionist civil state governments were no longer functioning. In areas where such governments did function, I did not have the authority to unilaterally emancipate slaves, which is why I had to work through the amendment process and to encourage state legislatures to abolish slavery within their states, which we accomplished in about half a dozen states between 1863 and 1865, by the way. But if you compare the areas covered by the Emancipation Proclamation, the ones where there was no Union civil government, like the coastal islands of South Carolina and North Carolina, like the northern tier of counties in Mississippi and Alabama, which had been occupied in 1862, those states did not have Unionist state governments. So the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect immediately in places like Corinth, Mississippi, and Beaufort, South Carolina, and New Bern, North Carolina, which had been under Union occupation for several months. Areas like Atlanta, Georgia, and Baton Rouge, Little Rock, Arkansas, there did not go into effect until months or years later as Union armies continued to advance. And areas of the South where loyal governments had been established, either because they'd never fallen, like in Kentucky, or because they'd been reestablished after Confederate governments had fled, like in Tennessee, were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, but we worked with state governments there to abolish slavery. And Tennessee did so in 1863. Kentucky, we were never able to convince to abolish slavery and had to force the measure on them through the 13th Amendment. So there were actually several states of which the Emancipation Proclamation was neither the first nor the last in which we abolished slavery. The first was the adoption of the contraband policy that Ben Butler drafted in the spring of 1861.
At Fort Monroe.
Indeed. Being a lawyer, he used a legal argument against Confederates who demanded he enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, saying that according to them, they were an independent nation and therefore the Fugitive Slave Act did not apply to them. And if it did, they were part of the United States in rebellion, and therefore these slaves were property being used in a criminal activity, rebellion, and were therefore contraband of war and were no longer their property either. And since the Confederates no longer owned them and we didn't want to, the only option left was that they were free.
Yeah, and when you bring up General Butler and the contraband escape, that actually kind of parallels your situation as the great emancipator, because that's how you are kind of set in the public's view of what happened. And Ben Butler is also given credit for the contraband escape and freedom seekers happening at Fort Monroe because he was the general in charge there. But in actuality, if those three men, James Townsend, Frank Baker, and Shepard Mallory, had not made the effort and had the agency to escape themselves, Butler wouldn't have had anything to do.
Yes, the slaves who self-liberated by escaping into Union lines gave us the opportunity to act. But again, this is a partnership. Both the white people in the government and the military and the black people who worked for their own freedom had to act.
Mhm.
Neither could accomplish this on their own.
Right.
The self-liberating slaves gave General Butler the opportunity to issue his contraband policy, which was the legal basis for my Emancipation Proclamation.
Mhm, mhm.
Uh,
Now, I've been told that you were not, you told Butler not to do that. You told your generals not to, uh, you know.
no, I supported Butler. I told other generals not to adopt other policies which went further. Uh, General Hunter in South Carolina
Uh-huh.
and General Fremont in Missouri both issued more sweeping anti-slavery proclamations that went beyond the contraband of war theory.
Mhm,
And they were treading on the prerogatives of the civil government.
mhm.
Uh, so I instructed them to reverse those more extreme policies and bring them in line with the contraband policy that General Butler had already issued.
Okay, okay.
Also, General Fremont's orders included instructions for the execution of civilians, and that was another thing that I did not want to allow to stand.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting, and that's why we're doing this podcast about the Emancipation Proclamation, because it's important history that needs to be understood properly.
Yes.
Because what is your statement? There's nothing worse than a.
I said there's no lie more vicious than a half-truth.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is how we get to.
Actually, vicious is probably the wrong word. Dangerous is a better word because the half-truth is convincing. You can look up this quote, and yes, Lincoln really did say that,
Right.
but it completely changes its meaning when you take it out of context like that.
Right.
To give an example from the other side, General Lee said, "I like whiskey." Makes him sound like lush, unless you realize the full statement is, "I like whiskey, which is why I so seldom drink it."
Right, exactly. And that makes me think about how they said that Grant was an alcoholic, and yet we don't really know the details of that. So you just kind of get the title, the label alcoholic, and you just that's all you got, and you go running with it.
Yes, I understand that historians have since been arguing considerably about the extent to which Grant drank.
Mm-hmm.
It was certainly a widely circulated story, even in the 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
I was urged to dismiss him for drunkenness back in 1862,
Mm-hmm.
and in one of the few good military decisions I made in the first half of the war, I refused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, that takes me to another topic that I wanted to just touch on. You, as a military strategist, was this a new discovered talent as you were forced to do it, or had you always been thinking about those type of scenarios?
No, I served in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War.
Mm-hmm.
I never saw combat. In fact, I mocked my own military record in political campaigns. Another officer bragged about the blood he had shed in America's wars, and I replied that in the Black Hawk War, I shed a great deal of blood too. That I had never actually seen an Indian in the wars, but I'd been bitten by a great many mosquitoes.
Understood.
And so when I became commander-in-chief of all the armies and navies of the United States during the Civil War, I very much had to learn on the job.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, a great many brave men paid the price for mistakes that I made during that learning process.
Kind of analogous with our current president, who has had over 350,000 people dying of a virus, and many of those did not have to die, according to the scientists and the political pundits.
Well, opinions about politicians after my death, I will leave as an exercise for the people who had experienced their decisions for good or ill. I will note that when the gentleman you're speaking of was nominated for president in 2016, the Republican delegation from Illinois issuing the usual spread eagle statements about how wonderful the state is, when they make their nomination. Alaska, the state with the longest coastline in the United States, that sort of thing. The Republican delegation from Illinois did not mention that Illinois was the land of Lincoln, even though it's on their license plates. The Republican Party of your day and the Republican Party of my day have very different ideologies in a lot of ways if you compare the party platforms of 1860 and 2016. They neglected to draft a new one in 2020. And again, whether the party has improved, deteriorated, or merely changed is an exercise for the 21st century observer and is beyond my purview.
Well, that brings me to why we're doing this again. This is the Portsmouth Theater Academy, and I'm going to read the press release that we had for the event here. And we've just got Sojourner Truth in the form of Julia Wiley, who has arrived. And, we're just kind of doing this. First of all, it's important to do it on today, January 1st, 2021, to acknowledge that this important document was released to the wider public on this date in 1863. And so our press release basically said, Portsmouth, Virginia, www.juneteenthva.org, which is our website, looking for Abe Lincoln and Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and other 19th century figures who were alive on January 1st, 1863, to participate in a reading of the Emancipation Proclamation this Friday, January 1st, 2021, starting at 1 p.m. at Trinity Church, located 500 Court Street in downtown Old Town Portsmouth. Find us in the Parish Hall. This is the Parish Hall, and we're located on the King Street side of the building. Mask required. Max group size inside the Parish Hall is 10. That's right, 10. Because of the pandemic, all of our rules have changed in terms of like how we do things. So I want to tell you that PTA-Live, we went live on December 26th on the first day of Kwanzaa with performances by Julia Wiley and a one-woman show entitled Sojourner Truth, and Jamil Mills, and Greg Etroff in the Confessions of Nat Turner. Other PTA-Live offerings include a set of Caribbean-flavored set of songs from steel pan drummer Miss Drums, and that will happen on this Sunday, January 3rd, here in the Parish Hall at Trinity Episcopal Church. We will go live at 1 o'clock, and we will also do, I'm going to premiere a new spoken word piece called Psst, I'm a Socialist. And that will be part of our PTA-Live starting on tomorrow, Saturday the 2nd, and Sunday the 3rd. Hey folks, Julia, we're live. But it's okay. We get to like edit and all that kind of good stuff. But we are wanting to also do a shout out to Father Grant Stokes and the entire Trinity Episcopalian Church community for providing Juneteenth Virginia a space to do our work, which is about bringing together arts and conversation to examine our nation's history, educate our communities, and heal the wounds of slavery without shame or blame. Juneteenth Virginia is rehabbing the old Colony Theater. It's 120 years old, the building, and it is located directly across the street from the Commodore Theater, which is our next door neighbor here at the church. The now gone Confederate monument was also in this same block. And although it is physically gone, something lingers and it cannot be ignored. So that dealing with what was in that space is going to be a part of our work. We look forward to coming together to figure out our next step, and that includes you, our viewing audience. It would be wonderful to hear from you and to find out what you're interested in knowing about, and also stories that you have and information that you have that you would want to share with us. And our goal to basically heal America from the wounds of slavery without shame or blame. We are members of a village focusing on expanding the role of the arts and understanding our local Tidewater Hampton Roads 757 history as we go about resetting, reconstructing, and rebuilding America. Now we want to get into the Emancipation Proclamation. I'd like to have Greg do his, reading of it or his speaking of it, and then we will engage with Sojourner Truth.
Right. Now, I would like to add that one of the misunderstandings about the Emancipation Proclamation in popular culture is that it is the end-all and be-all of the emancipation policy of my administration. It was neither the first nor the last step we took in that regard. It was the middle of a 4-year path that had begun with our efforts to ban slavery's further expansion into the Western territories, accelerated with the contraband decision, the Confiscation Acts that Congress passed in 1862, the emancipation of slavery in the District of Columbia, an offer for the loyal slave states for federal compensation if they would voluntarily abolish slavery. Then came the Emancipation Proclamation, federal lobbying of the restored state governments in the South to abolish slavery, which several of them did, and culminating in the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865. And of course, that can be tied in to the civil rights amendments and congressional acts of the 1860s and 70s as well, though that happened after my death, and I can't take credit for those policies.
Well, and that brings me to the point that many people lament your untimely death 5 days after Robert E. Lee, Confederate general, surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. And the loss potential of what could have happened if you had lived, sir, rings loudly in this day and age as we see that the legacy of slavery continues to impact who we are here in America.
So, my position on slavery radicalized over the course of the war, and it is an open question about whether I would have continued to radicalize and embrace the civil rights policies of the radical Republicans, or if I would have been among those who, like Andrew Johnson, Francis Blair, approved of the abolition of slavery, but wanted to stop there and became a conservative force in the 1860s and 70s. And the actor portraying me believes that I would have continued to radicalize, but he is not unbiased. He's a bit of a Lincoln fanboy, the way I'm a Henry Clay fanboy. He may see me through rose-colored glasses. Certainly, it's a matter that historians have been debating for the past 155 years and will continue to debate as long as my poor service lingers in people's memories.
Well, I think it's true that no one alive in 2021 believes that the Republican Party of today is still the party of Lincoln.
Political parties often change radically. The Democratic Party of my presidency was already a very different organization than the Democratic Party had been when it was founded by Andrew Jackson in the 1820s. My party, the Republicans, was too new to have radically changed when I became president, but its positions changed considerably over the course of my administration.
Right.
And certainly the Whig Party, to which I had belonged before its collapse and the emergence of the Republican Party, changed dramatically from its founding in the 1830s to its collapse in the 1850s. So yes, people change their views, organizations change their views, history marches on, and taking a still photograph from any moment, no matter how accurately it portrays that moment, cannot portray the flow of history. pulling a cup of water from a stream does not tell you what the headwaters of that stream are like or how things will look once they flow into the ocean.
Mhm, mhm. Indeed, you are correct about that, sir. So would we want to do the text?
All right. So reminding the audience again that this is a single moment in history, only part of the process rather than the end all and be all. We can take that photograph of the point of the River of Time where it crosses into 1863. And may I borrow a copy of the text? There are some documents that I've been able to memorize, but the Emancipation Proclamation is a legal document and a rather dry one at that.
Indeed, it is. I agree with that. As in fact, I said, a lot of people said it didn't do anything except give Lincoln a date to put on the calendar because it didn't free everyone immediately.
This is true. It went into immediate effect for tens of thousands of slaves, but the enslaved population of the country in 1860 was just under 4 million. It was, so we're talking about a very small percentage of the population affected on that day, though the vast majority of slaves were affected by the proclamation over the next 2.5 years.
Indeed, indeed. And I'm sorry, and before you start that, so Julia, were you going to read the Emancipation Proclamation? Did you have a text that you brought, or do you need a copy?
No,
No. You want to just elaborate a little bit more on that?
the script, the script
All right.
from the abolitionist museums.
No.
That was the proclamation, right?
No,
Yeah,
that's
the
the
Gettysburg
Gettysburg
Address
Address.
was in.
Oh, that's good. Oh, no,
Written by
I'm
the same
sorry.
author,
No, I
but in a different context there.
I'm sorry, I did not.
Okay.
But I brought my iPad to look it up.
Uh-huh.
The only thing is that this iPad's been cleared, and I need the password again for.
Oh, no,
We
we have
the version on old-fashioned
Oh.
paper that you can use.
So what we can do, I want to have Lincoln alone doing it, and then I want to have the two of you to do it.
Okay.
And so
So you want me to be studying the?
I'm gonna give you a copy of that right now. So here it is, right here.
Would you like me to do the solo reading now?
Yes, yes.
You know, when we do this thing, we're gonna take certain parts of it.
Yeah, we can edit. We'll edit this. This is live, and live is
Right,
live.
right.
You know,
So
but
even live, do you want us to take different parts of this?
yeah, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna have Lincoln do it by himself, and then I'm gonna have Lincoln and Truth work it together.
Okay,
So there, that's what we're working with. That's your script right there.
okay.
Okay. Alrighty.
By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Whereas, on the 22nd day of September, AD 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January, AD 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, henceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the states and parts of states, if any, in which the people thereof, respectively, shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people of shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections, wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such states shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such states and people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January, AD 1863, and in accordance with my purpose to do so, publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the first day above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states where the people thereof, respectively, are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Pacamines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Assumption, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that, in all case when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. Now, the parts of states and states within the self-styled Confederacy that were exempted from this order: the state of Tennessee, the counties of Virginia that I listed, including the parts that became West Virginia, and the parishes of Louisiana, although exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, were emancipated through state action. In West Virginia, my administration and my allies in Congress refused to admit the state of West Virginia until it agreed to include a passage in its state constitution abolishing slavery. The first version they submitted allowed slavery to survive, and we rejected it. They included a passage for gradual abolition called the Willey Amendment, which declared that all slaves born after the year 1842 would be freed at a series of set ages though the slaves born before 1842 would be grandfathered out of the document. This gradual abolition policy was the same as had been used in most northern states to end slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The states of Virginia, Louisiana, and Tennessee restored Unionist governments that we helped set up in those states, abolished slavery during the course of the war. Virginia in its 1864 state constitution, Tennessee in 1863, and I believe Louisiana in 1864. The Louisiana Unionist government that abolished slavery drafted a new constitution which would have banned black suffrage. My administration convinced them to delete that passage from their proposed constitution and leave the matter of suffrage to the state legislature. The 4 states which allowed slavery, which had not joined the rebellion, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. Maryland and Missouri state governments adopted new anti-slavery constitutions in 1865. Delaware and Kentucky rejected such notions, and their slavery was ended by the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865.
Thank you, Mr. Lincoln. So now we're going to do another reading of the proclamation with Sojourner Truth and President Lincoln. And I wish I could find this picture. There's a great picture of Lincoln and Sojourner Truth when she visited the White House. And I have it on another phone, but not on this particular phone. But what we'll do is we'll show that when we edit this video and include that photograph, that iconic photograph of Lincoln and Sojourner Truth. So now we're being joined by Julia Wiley, who portrays Sojourner Truth in our play Abolitionist Museum. And most recently, she was here on PTA-Live with our developing project about Sojourner Truth, a one-woman show that we have been talking about for 20 years and finally have started to work on here in 2020, going into 2021. So we've got Julia on the other side of the table here, so we need to bring you on this side, Julia. Julia, I'm gonna bring you down here.
Okay, want me to sit over?
Yeah, let's have you over here. I'm gonna share. Share. Good one. Okay. Yeah, you can give yourself some space here. There you go. And we are figuring this out now in terms of how we're going to do this, but I'm thinking that Sojourner will open it up with at the very top and go down to end it with right here in there, because then Lincoln starts to speak. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, and we'll pick it up.
And do it right here.
Yeah, you would, Sojourner would go.
Okay,
Mhm.
and,
Then Lincoln picks it up.
mhm.
Okay. And wow, Lincoln pretty much tells the story at that point. Yeah, so Lincoln would then pick it up there and go all the way through to, and I further declare, to the bottom of 2, right? Lincoln goes all the way there. And then you pick it up again, Sojourner.
Okay, he goes to, and I further declare.
So
All
Miss Truth picks up and upon this act.
Mm-hmm.
And I pick it.
You pick it up there, and you finish it together. Okay.
So we both read the final paragraph.
Yes. Text of Lincoln's proclamation issued January 1st, 1863, by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Hold on. Text of Lincoln's proclamation. Never chew gum while you're on camera. That's a rule that the Portsmouth Theater Academy will enforce. Text of Lincoln's proclamation issued January 1st, 1863, by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation.
Whereas on the 22nd day of September, A.D. 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following to wit, that on the first day of January, A.D. 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be then, thenceforth and forever free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any effort they may make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January, aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the states and part of states, if any, in which the people thereof respectively shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such states shall have participated, shall in the absence of strong countervailing testimony be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States.
Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January, A.D. 1863, and in accordance with my purpose so to do, publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the first day above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof, respectively, are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Palcomines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Terrebonne, La Fourche, Saint Mary, Saint Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are, for the present, left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And, by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within such designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that, in all case when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act sincerely believe to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
Can we get that last section together again? Let's do, I'll give you a 2 count here. 1, 2.
And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
One more time. 1, 2.
And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
Thank you. I feel like we can do one more run with that, and then we'll have enough to be able to edit together, best of the two best. So if we take a swallow of fresh air here, and a deep breath, and somebody need water or anything like that?
Yeah.
All right, so you want to go to the top?
Yes, I did. Do you need some water?
Yes.
Okay, hold on 1 second. You guys can chat at Sojourner and Lincoln if you need to, or want to. I think all we might have is tap water. Let me check.
You vexed me mightily, Miss Truth.
I can't remember. Yeah, when I said that was Abraham. What? But that Abraham. Do you believe in God? That was that Abraham? Who was that? Was asking, do you believe in God?
Oh, I don't remember. Wait, you asked John Brown, and he replied that yes, but God is angry.
Yes, and then I talked to who was that I used to say, do you believe in God?
Frederick. Yeah.
Frederick.
And
Do you believe in God?
and Harry Beecher Stowe gets in the middle of that.
Oh, because John Brown
God lives, but he's angry.
yes.
Yeah.
And there we go.
Hey, come on.
You were thirsty, huh?
We are taping, okay? So you cannot speak. So you take your two hips back to the table. The body has one hip, one on each side. So he takes the two of them and go back to the table. That's in case you people didn't know what I meant by two hips.
Oh, that boy minds you better than Tad ever minded me.
Okay,
All right.
so here we go.
So do the intro again. Text of Lincoln's Proclamation, issued January 1st, 1863, by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation.
Whereas on the 22nd day of September, AD 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January 8th, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then there thenceforth and forever free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority, therefore will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any effort they may make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January, as foresaid by, as foresaid,
Start again.
that the executive will, on the first day of January, as foresaid by proclamation, designate the states and part of states, if any, in which the people therefore respectively shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such states shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States.
Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January, A.D. 1863, and in accordance with my purpose to do so, publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the day above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof, respectively, are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Palcamines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Assumption, Terrebonne, La Fourche, Sainte Mary, Saint Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and with the accepted parts for the present day left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforth shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that, in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice. Shall we start that a bit again? 1, 2. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
There we go. You know, I thought the Emancipation Proclamation was much longer for some reason until I started prepping for today. And yet it is relatively brief because, as many would say, it didn't really free anyone, so it didn't need to be very long. Just teasing, Mr. Lincoln. But yeah, we wanted to, as I said at the top of all of this, to get people more familiar with the Emancipation Proclamation and a lot of these, what we call primary source documents. Is that the proper term, Greg?
Yes.
Okay. We want folks to know about Abolitionist Museum, of which Abraham Lincoln and Sojourner Truth are 2 of the 8 historical figures who are wax figures in the museum. The museum curator brings in a Confederate flag, and they debate whether or not to burn that flag. And in this time of racial reckoning and conversations, this play is a very good tool to be able to start those conversations and have those conversations have some meaning to them. We have people who are able to speak honestly and listen carefully as a result of participating in a presentation of the play. So we want to encourage folks out there, churches, temples, synagogues, schools, civic groups, to think about purchasing a copy of Abolitionist Museum and producing it in your own community. We are, of course, available, as consultants and want to be able to help communities get these conversations started in their communities, and this is one way by which you can do that. So you go to our website, which is at www.juneteenthva.org, and certainly everybody knows how to spell Juneteenth at this point, but we'll just do it one more time just for fun. Juneteenth is Juneteenth, Juneteenth. Juneteenth, VA. VA, of course, the abbreviation for Virginia. Juneteenth, Virginia is located in Portsmouth, Virginia. And what we're doing today on PTA Live is giving you a little bit of understanding of what we do, which is to train people to be historical reenactors, as well as actors on a Broadway stage. Those are two skill sets that are very similar in many ways, and yet very different in other ways. And you come here and you learn how to do the research, and then it's about the interpretation of that research that we put on the stage. And a big part of everything that we do is a post-show discussion. Once we present the work, then we want to just talk about, what's been presented and why it matters and what it means. And so again, Portsmouth Theater Academy welcomes you to oh my gosh, talking about another platform. I think we're on YouTube today. But our goal is to be on all of the major platforms so that you can participate and be a part of what we do. Greg, Julia, did you want to share anything today and talk about anything more in terms of this project here or the other projects that you're looking to work with?
One interesting thing for me about Abolitionist Museum is that since Abraham Lincoln represents the most moderate element of the anti-slavery movement, the group that wanted to work gradually and within the existing legal framework, and by persuading pro-slavery forces that the institution had to go, he found himself taking fire from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
To the Confederates, he was a wild-eyed abolitionist, no different from John Brown.
Mm-hmm.
But to the other abolitionists in Abolitionist Museum, Lincoln is the reactionary obstructionist.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the context of this play, I am by far the most conservative figure, while in the Civil War, Lincoln is portrayed by both Confederates and by Northern Democrats as a wild-eyed radical visionary who is going to try and burn down the existing system. And neither of these views are really accurate. He was a moderate reformer, which does make him seem like a bitter, set in his ways reactionary when he's talking with someone like John Brown,
Right.
And seem like a dangerous radical when he's talking with someone like Roger Kennedy.
It's funny, you reminded me of the early days of the play, and a dear friend, Greg Raver Lampman, who is a writer primarily, he played Abraham Lincoln. And we would go into middle schools and Abraham Lincoln would get booed. And he said, I remember saying, who knew that playing Lincoln would be playing the heavy? Because Lincoln is revered, and it was just so funny that would happen. Because Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, John Brown, Nat Turner, David Walker, they were all like, burn that flag. And you and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass were like, no, we can't do that.
Yes. Lincoln is the only figure in the play who tried to end slavery by working within the system. The others are all revolutionaries. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a revolutionary through passive resistance, working with the Underground Railroad and that sort of thing. And some of the others favored violent revolution, but they all wanted to tear the system down. And so Lincoln is very isolated in the play because although he represents a majority of the anti-slavery movement in the 19th century, he's the only member of that majority in the room in this production.
Right, exactly. So it's been an exciting and fun experience in terms of the Abolitionist Museum because we have, historical figures playing against type and against their actual histories and records and lives. And that's what I think makes the play so much fun and why it works really well in terms of being a teaching tool, not only for historical reenactors, but for acting on the Broadway stage. You know, it's just kind of like the example of what it's supposed to be. Julia, what are your thoughts?
Well, Sojourner Truth, and she's one of the main persons in Abolitionist Museum who is for the flag burning. She's, it's like everybody's spending so much time bickering among themselves that they're forgetting the point uh, of what I felt as though was more important, was to burn the flag. When I think it was the curator that brings the flag in, and I hold the flag up and says that I think that should be the issue
Yeah,
of the topic, was to discuss the flag.
you weren't even interested. Sojourner was not even interested in debate.
Right, all that going on. What are we going to do about this flag? And everybody's still running their mouth. And I'm saying, well, that's good and fine about that issue, but let's get back to this flag. And they just keep going on. So at the end, that's when I get real forceful, and says, let's burn this flag. And people saying, burn it. And some saying, no, don't burn it.
So the timing couldn't be better in terms of what's going on in the world today as we go around the country and monuments and statues are being uprooted and torn up and taken away from their original locations, and which seems to me to be kind of not as productive as it could be. By taking these statues and just hiding them away, we don't discuss them in terms of why they were initially put there and who put them there, and how does it fit in terms of the context of where we are today. There's no conversation going on. It's simply uprooting and hiding away that past. And if that's the answer, I'm not sure.
And
Well, I have said in the past that I felt like the solution was putting them in the museum. Well, everybody didn't seem to feel the same way I did. Never understood why, but I felt like that was a solution. You got someone who will discuss what this particular artifact is about, or you have some type of written explanation of what it is so people can know. You're not really hiding it if you put it in a museum, but people will have to come to a museum to know about it, unless for some reason somebody decides to make it more known with either a play or with a movie, or even what we're doing right here.
And when the Confederate monuments were constructed, primarily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were put in front of courthouses or on the edge of predominantly African-American neighborhoods because they were designed to be very public statements that the powers that be, the local and state governments, adhered to the ideals that informed the Confederacy. They put up a statue of John Calhoun facing a black neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina, I believe.
Who was Charles Calhoun? Who was he?
John Calhoun was the godfather of Southern nationalism in the early 19th century, basically. He died in 1850, so he was not involved in the secession movement. But in the 1830s, he favored the power of Southern states to nullify federal laws. He favored federal restrictions on free speech rights to suppress abolitionist literature in the South. He opposed the Compromise of 1850. and he was the intellectual leader of a movement to push Southern slaveholding interests over all others in the country. And although he hoped that the dissolution of the Union could be avoided and that the Southern slaveholding interests could achieve their objectives within the Union, his policies had a great deal to do with the ramping up of
Is
such
that John
things.
Franklin?
That's him.
Can we put his picture right there in front of the camera, the view over there?
So this is John Calhoun, somewhat later in life. This looks like an 1840s photograph.
Doesn't he
What-
look kind of weird, like the devil or something like that?
Yes, but there's actually a picture of him that is much worse from several years later. He's got this little neck beard and nothing on his face, and his hair's turned completely white, and it's kind of long and in a page boy, and he's glowering even harder than that. Now, if you look at a painting of him from the 1820s, he was actually an extremely handsome man. So I love to put up this painting of him from 1820 and this photograph of him from 1850 and say, this is what a lifetime of hating does to a human face.
John C. Calhoun, perhaps the most prominent political theorist of the slaveholding South and an influence on modern right-wing thinking. This guy looks just like Satan here, and he's
Yeah.
scary looking here.
And like I said, it gets worse a few years later.
Oh my goodness gracious.
I believe he's in that book that you have.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
Of his picture.
Yeah.
And the ironic thing is that at the start of his career, he was a nationalist. He was in favor of a strong central government and a protective tariff to foster American industry. And he'd been an ally of Henry Clay in Congress before the War of 1812.
Right.
And he just, starting in the 1820s, went in a completely different direction.
He's like a Lindsey Graham.
In some ways, yes. I mentioned earlier that people's political positions change over time, that Lincoln gradually moved from a very moderate gradualist anti-slavery figure to an outright abolitionist by 1865, when in 1864, he's running on passing the 13th Amendment. Calhoun went in the opposite direction. He started out very much a reasonable figure who thought the South could work within the existing framework and cooperate with other sections. And by the end of his life was just digging in his heels and saying, yeah. As late as the 1840s, he was saying, well, can we extend the Missouri Compromise line and split the territory we conquered from Mexico between free and slave territory? And when David Wilmot, a Pennsylvania Democrat, proposed a law saying any land that's free under Mexican law will stay free, Calhoun not only rejected that, but said, you know what, banning slavery anywhere is unconstitutional, even though 6 months before he'd been saying, let's ban slavery in half of the territory and allow it in the other half. So
It's kind of like politicians will say what needs to be said in the moment. And we have that, the continuing of that happening, as we are living in today's moment, when suddenly people are contesting a democratically run election and questioning whether or not it is valid. I mean, that is happening as we speak today.
and in a lot of narratives, John Calhoun is the central villain of early 19th century American history. And certainly the leaders of the Confederacy looked to him as their intellectual leader, and their arguments within the South were how best to carry Calhoun's ideals forward.
Right. Well, again, this is what Portsmouth Theater Academy looks to do, is to bring forward those figures in history who we don't really know about, but who had an incredible impact on where we are today. The United States of America as it exists today started here in this region, in the Tidewater Hampton Roads region, 1607 at Jamestown, and then 12 years later in 1619, the first of the Africans who joined the Jamestown colony, not joined, but were brought into the Jamestown colony, primarily we believe as indentured servants. And they worked their contracts, earned their freedom, and ultimately became free blacks, and could be considered the ancestors of the black middle class. And to talk about a black middle class before the 19th century is unheard of. But because we come at this history from an African American perspective, we see it in a different way. We expand the topic, the subject matter, we expand the explanations and the possibilities of what all of this means. And it again is about talking about it, understanding it from that perspective, and participating in a real way.
The institution of chattel slavery did not appear instantly. It evolved over several decades of increasingly repressive policies.
Yeah,
And
it's an institution. Slavery was an institution built in the Virginia codes. People went to court, and those court decisions built that institution of slavery. Sojourner Truth actually has the distinction of being the first African-American woman to go to court and win against her judgment against the white male. That was big news because, that was, again, how the institution of slavery was built.
What year was that?
What year was that? Do you remember?
It was before, let me see. I am trying to remember when that happened. I think it was in the 1830s. I'm not sure.
I think
It
you're
was
right.
before the women's convention.
It was for the women's committee. We'll find out for you and let you know because it was an important date.
And there were civil rights victories even before the Civil War. Slavery was abolished in the northern states. In 1854, exactly 100 years before the Brown v. Board decision, there was another court decision that outlawed segregation on mass transit in New York City. And the lawyer who served in the Thurgood Marshall role and won that case was a young country bumpkin lawyer from New England named Chester Alan Arthur, who about 25, 30 years later became president of the United States. And
Really?
yes, Chester Alan Arthur is largely ignored in American history. Oh, he's one of those guys who became president because the real guy got shot. And nobody remembers that he had this phase of his career where he was a crusading civil rights lawyer.
No, nobody knows that.
I mean, I only found out because I wandered into the New York City Mass Transit Museum in Brooklyn and saw this display about the case and this picture of a young, skinny Chester Alan Arthur
Right.
On the display. I'm a 19th century American history geek, and I had no idea until I stumbled across this by accident.
So,
When was this?
The case was in 1854, and I found out about it probably in 2010.
proving once again the value of art in our society. We definitely need that as a way of making these type of connections, which are so very important in terms of the healing that we need to be able to, to move forward. Art, plug for art,
Yeah, like that big grave site that's in New York.
Oh, when
About
they
that?
discovered the,
A real big one
The
that they
18th
found.
century African-American cemetery that had been paved over.
They found it when they were redoing New York not very long ago. And they found the bodies,
yeah.
so they put a monument up.
Mhm.
But this was not that long ago. What was it, 10 years
It's
ago?
been within 10 years.
Something like that, 10 or 15 years ago, they found the bodies.
Mhm.
And that was happening in our time, but these
Right.
bodies were found. And they put a monument up in New York City about these. I just found out about that.
Well, when the Dutch
Couple
set
years
up
ago.
their New Netherlands colony, they wanted the Hudson Valley to be a slaveholding plantation society. They were granting these huge estates called patroonships, and they wanted to bring in European indentured servants and black slaves and run them as these neo-medieval estates. But the Hudson Valley is too cold to grow cotton or good tobacco or indigo, and they could never get enough workers or make enough money on the crops they did grow. So the system was starved by this lack of an effective cash crop, and slavery survived on a fairly large scale for the North in New York, but on a much smaller scale than anywhere in the South during its period as an English colony in the late 17th and 18th centuries. And in 1799, New York, now an American state with internal sovereignty, passed a gradual abolition law. And then in 1827, I believe, the final abolition law, which freed those slaves that had been grandfathered out of the 1799 bill, and New York finally became completely a free state.
The New York, on what research that I found out, New York had just as many slaves because the Dutch started that. They were the ones that discovered New York State in the first place. That's who Sojourner Truth.
Yeah,
She was born into a.
So basically, what was on the paper
Yes.
was not practiced in
Yes,
reality.
the famous, I think is the Dutch Eastern India Trading Company. They became monotony, where they had so much money, they had dominated them, but they did not take slaves to the South. That's what they did not do. They only put slaves into New York State, and they took the rest of their slaves to the Caribbean, all the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, the Spanish,
Right.
and South America. That's where they took their
yeah,
slaves.
the areas that the Dutch ruled, which in North America it was just New York and New Jersey and a bit of
Yeah,
Delaware,
but
and their big possessions were in the Caribbean and South America.
right, but they had other slave ships that did take slaves to the South. That was the Spanish and the French. Spanish and the French, they became jealous of the Dutch Eastern India Company, and they wanted to make all that money too. So they started their big campaign trying to make money. All these countries wanted to run the slaves,
Oh yeah, everyone was in on it.
competing against each other
Right.
about money, playing with people's lives, which we feel as though it was today.
I'm
And,
glad you said today, because what we want to do is create that bridge from what happened in the past to what's going to happen today, reparations.
what
Who's gonna pay
has
the
happened
reparations?
today?
Who made the money and who now has to be responsible for
Yeah.
reparations?
What has happened today is all over the world, you've got people, the ascendants of slaves, looking for some type of closure.
Mhm.
It's just arising all over. It's not just United States. This is going on in the other countries too, and everybody's feeling guilty because look how many people dominated things. The British dominated, the French dominated, the Spanish dominated, and the Dutch had their half as to what they were doing when they started.
Approximately 15 million Africans were forcibly taken from their home continent and brought to the Americas. Roughly 20% of them, about 3 million, died on the trip. Of the 12 million who landed in the Americas alive, most landed in the Caribbean and Latin America. I believe about 800,000 landed in areas that are now in the United States.
Well, from what I can see when I followed the trail of how the Dutch was doing, the Dutch left the Netherlands, and they went down to Africa, which was here, Africa. They picked up the slaves, and they were going further down when they was reaching South America and the Caribbeans, and then they came back up. When they on their way back up to New York, which New York was a straight shot across to the Netherlands. Those slaves, if you think about it, how was the slaves going to leave Africa, live all the way down to South America and the Caribbean, and live all the way back past it again, way up to the top and to New York? By the time they got to New York, they were dead.
Like the
Because that was the way. Because you see, that was the trail.
Right.
They wasn't going to go to Africa and take Africans to New York. No, that wasn't. That was out of their way. When they just went down here to Africa, they was going to keep going, dropping the Africans off down to South America, Caribbean, and on the way going back up.
In terms of
The slaves died. They were not passengers of the southern slaves. They did not drop slaves off to the south. The Dutch ship only they took what was left to New York
they mostly go to the colonies they control.
because that's where their colony was. The Dutch colony that was in the America was in New York. So they wasn't trying to drop any slaves off to the south because they didn't have any colonies there.
Well, Sojourner Truth was owned by people who were Dutch.
Or Dutch, right,
And spoke only Dutch until she was about 9 or 10 years old.
right.
And there's a great amount of information that gets shared in the Sojourner One Woman Show, which I hope that you will avail yourselves of when it is available online. And to that end, we got to wrap up today, folks. This has been wonderful. Appreciate your time and your energy and your hard work in terms of researching and developing these fictitious, realistic. We got to come up with new terms for like what we do here, because it's not fiction, it's not totally documentary.
It's historical fiction, so it's the bones of it are what happened as best as our research can indicate, and we emotionally flesh it out with what we imagine reasonably might have happened.
You know, I hear you. Historical fiction, the using the word fiction in it kind of bothers me.
Yeah, right.
Because because historical fiction, maybe you can make up something that has no truth whatsoever. But
In historic fiction, there always has to be an underpinning of truth, or it's just a straight fiction.
right, exactly.
But let me say too that in one of the books that I had brought, it talks about the groups of people that suffered. Okay, the Jews, the Holocaust, they have theirs and filmed because the Germans filmed them killing those Jews. They filmed the whole thing. They filmed them while they was making them in the soap. That was something you cannot deny. The Jews got that evidence and they will hold on to it. And if anybody says anything that was said that did not happen, they will show you say it didn't happen. We didn't have that because the Germans were so arrogant to take these films, and while they're posing, and I only know about this from going to ODU, when they showed that film, and the Germans are sitting up there posing and showing off.
Well, they had evidence. We don't have
Yes,
evidence.
Yes, so people cannot say it didn't happen. People cannot say some of it was fictional. People cannot say that this thing did not take place. The what happened with the Holocaust, what happened to the Africans, and what happened to the Indians, all suffered. They all suffered. And what happened to the Indians, I feel as though that was a great injustice. I feel very, not only with my African side, that I feel bad about what happened to the Africans. I feel bad what happened to the Indians because I feel as though I have history in that too. A lot of slaves went to the Indians as a refuge, a lot of them, and joined with the Indians to stop what was going on. They took those people's land and left them with, oh, I don't even want to think about it.
So yes,
Come on, man.
the
That
Seminole,
was terrible.
so the Seminole community in Florida
Well,
was
yeah,
a mix
for Florida,
of
yes.
refugee Indians and African Americans.
Yes, but it
but-
wasn't just in Florida.
Well, as
Yeah.
you see, folks, I'm
but,
getting information about this.
But right next door in Alabama and Georgia, you had
And
Creeks
Carolina.
and Cherokee
The
and other
Cherokee
tribes
Indians,
who
yes.
themselves set up plantations and kept black slaves. So it's always a complex thing where you can't look at any one of these groups as monolithic. The individuals
Yeah.
within them, or even the different communities within them, had very different reactions to the historical and economic and social pressures of the time.
Yeah, that still affects everybody
In fact,
today.
in
The
Oklahoma, there are
Jews will-
still arguments about whether or not the descendants of black slaves of the Cherokee should have Cherokee tribal rights.
Yes,
And they're still arguing about it.
they talked about that, but the black people, they know, about their background with the Cherokee. They're not trying to, making a big thing about whether or not they're going to receive rights. They're not making a big thing about that. I mean, if they do, they do. They don't, they don't. The Indians want to get their rights, so of course they're not going to want to share it with the black slaves. But it's not a big loss.
I agree with that, but
You don't think that that's the reason why, like he was saying about if they was going to give Indian rights to the black slaves, if the Indians was going to give it to the black slaves, to declare them Indians. But I don't think that black people are running around saying this is unfair. The Indians won't let us be Indians. I don't see that going on.
There are descendants of African Americans who were enslaved by the Cherokee Creek.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
Who are arguing for this. There are court cases in the works in places like Oklahoma now. It's not a big national argument, but the discussion is happening.
Yeah, because they left Florida and they went to Oklahoma, but some of the tribes stayed in Florida. That's the thing. Originally, they were supposed to have moved all of them. The government was trying to break it up.
right.
So they went and took all the Indians from Florida and took them to Oklahoma. But you see, the Everglades, white man did not know the Everglades. They got them snakes and them alligators. So which means they knew how to hide in the Everglades. So they didn't catch them all. They thought they did, but they didn't.
Yeah, there were a series of wars
There were a
down
whole
there
bunch
from
of
the
them still in
1830s
Florida.
to the
That stayed in
1850s.
Florida.
Right. Yeah, that's a whole conversation.
I know, a whole nother conversation.
So we're going to say goodbye, sign off for now, January 1st, 2021. And thank you, Sojourner Truth and President Abraham Lincoln for this discussion and reading of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Okay.